Hello class, this is Professor Boyer. This lecture will cover the reading from Ralph McInerny's Ethica Thomistica, Chapter 2, on the good for man in Aristotle and Aquinas. In this reading, McInerny is giving his own comments and overview of things we have previously read, namely Aristotle's explanation of the ultimate good in Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, and Aquinas' laying out of the nature of happiness in Summa Theologiae Prima Secundae, questions 1 through 5. So we're going to look at McInerny's analysis of these things. Ralph McInerny was a professor of philosophy who taught at Notre Dame, University of Notre Dame, for many years. He started there in 1955 and he passed away a few years ago. So with that in mind, let us begin. So McInerny goes over Aristotle's argument for the ultimate end, and he gives us an interpretation of what Aristotle means by this. So he looks at how Aristotle gets to the idea that there's an ultimate end, and he does it in this way. He says, first, Aristotle seems to be defining good, and good as what actions aim at, and actions aim at some end, and they aim at an end because it is thought to be perfective of the agent. So we can understand goodness as what is perfective of an agent, and goodness as being, therefore, the object of action. Now, the question, though, is what is actually perfective of an agent? We need to determine what is actually perfective as opposed to what merely appears to be such. So in this way, McInerny sees Aristotle dealing with the problem of disagreement about the human end. He says, quote, whatever a human person does or seeks is done or sought under this broad assumption that something is perfective of us. But of course, not everything so sought is really perfective of the agent. Thus, Aristotle proceeds on the assumption that knowledge of the kind of end and the kind of agent we are will provide a criterion for distinguishing among those things we seek between those that are truly perfective of us from those that are not. Hence, the traditional talk of real and apparent goods. So McInerny is emphasizing that Aristotle is, if there's an interruption, it might be my toddler coming over. So just ignore those. Anyway, so McInerny sees Aristotle as defining actions in terms of their ends and needing to seek a definition, an objective definition of goodness and perfection in order for us to be able to tell what ends are actually good and perfective of us and what ends are not. And so the way that we can do this is if we have a universal standard that we can apply to every single action. If we have some criteria that we can apply to every action, then we'll be able to more easily determine whether an action is actually perfective of us or not. If there's not a universal criteria that we can apply to every single action, we're going to have to look at each individual action and all the circumstances surrounding it, and we're never going to easily be able to determine what is actually perfective of us. So this leads Aristotle to use sub and superordination. It means to gather together different kinds of actions and different kinds of ends of actions to be able to evaluate them all on equal footing. So in the case of horse riding, we say that the action of saddle making, the action of bridle making, the action of stirrup making, these can all be evaluated in terms of a higher thing, namely horse riding, since all these actions are directed towards producing equipment for horse riding. Horse riding then becomes the standard against which we can evaluate whether the way you're making a stirrup or the way you're making a saddle is actually correct and good. So in that way we can take stirrup making, saddle making, and bridle making and have a common rule that we can apply to all of them to evaluate them. And so Aristotle uses the idea of an order among actions. Some actions are means to a further end, and he does this in order that we can have some sort of universal measure, which we can look at each action and say, does this action perfect us as humans, or does it not perfect us as humans? So this leads to the argument, or to the claim, that there is one ultimate end for man. Now, McInerny spends a lot of time considering this claim that there's one ultimate end for man, because everything that Aristotle is doing follows upon this. So he sees Aristotle as initially giving a hypothetical, an if-then statement, a theory, which would provide a way to analyze, broadly speaking, the goodness of every possible end of human action using a similar framework. So let's look at this line. McInerny quotes Aristotle. If, and I've added the bolds here, if there is some end of the things we do, which we desire for its own sake, everything else being desired for the sake of this, and if we choose everything for the sake of something else, at that rate the process would go on to infinity, so that our desire would be empty and vain, then clearly this must be the good and our chief good. So if we ignore that second parenthetical remark about the process going on to infinity, so that our desire would be empty and vain, we see that Aristotle is giving us a theory. He's making a hypothetical remark. He's saying that if there's some ultimate end, if there's some coordinating purpose of all actions that we perform, we can evaluate each action based on whether or not it is directed towards and helps us to achieve this ultimate end. And this ultimate end, which is directive of all of their actions, or which is used to evaluate all of their actions, would be the good, because it's the thing that is aimed at in every single case. And it's our chief good, because that's the reason why we perform actions at all. Now, if we leave out that second parenthetical remark, Aristotle is just saying, if there is such an ultimate purpose to life, then we can, if we discover that purpose, we can evaluate all our actions in relation to the purpose. But that doesn't actually establish that there is such a purpose to life. This is where McInerny sees that we need to turn to the second parenthetical remark. Aristotle here seems to be making an argument that there must be some ultimate end. The idea first is that if there wasn't an ultimate end, if there wasn't one ultimate purpose of all human actions, then it seems that we would choose to perform each action for the sake of some further end, and that for some further end, and that for some further end, and that would lead to infinite regress. So that way, there would never be an ultimate purpose behind desiring or performing any action. And this seems to imply that Aristotle isn't just saying, if this is the case, then there must be something which is the highest good. But rather, there is an ultimate goal of all human action, and this, therefore, is the chief good. Now he also proves this, or argues for this, McInerny says, by making comments about politics, saying if there was an ultimate good, an ultimate purpose of human action, which was common to all human actions, this would be something that would be studied by and would be the concern of politics. Politicians would consider what the ultimate good of human beings was, and would take this into consideration when passing laws and when governing. They would try to achieve this end through their governance and through the laws that they passed, and Aristotle thinks, oh, they actually do this. And so since politicians actually do this, that would be counted as pointing towards the existence of an ultimate end. Secondly, the comment that all men agree that there is some ultimate end called happiness. Now, although people don't agree as to what happiness is, nevertheless, the fact that everyone agrees that there is something that we all seek called happiness is taken to point to the idea that there's one ultimate goal behind everything that we do. So McInerny then, having given this analysis of Aristotle, considers three objections that people often make to Aristotle. The first is that Aristotle doesn't really understand the nature of ends. So Aristotle seems to be thinking that all the actions we perform for some one ultimate purpose. But oftentimes it seems that we don't perform all of our actions for some one ultimate purpose. Oftentimes I can do an action in order to be able to do that action better. So I want A for the sake of B, and B for the sake of C, and C for the sake of A. So in this case, A would be done for its own sake. McInerny gives us the example of someone who works out and tries to be healthy in order that he might be able to go to work and be able to earn money at work. And he goes to work in order that he can earn money so he can go on vacation. And he goes on vacation in order that he might be rested and relaxed and thus be healthy. So it seems like he seeks to be healthy in order to be healthy. That doesn't seem like there's one ultimate good beyond health that he's seeking. So that would seem to be one problem. The second one is that most of us don't have a single goal in our lives. We're not devoting all of our life's work to just achieving one ultimate thing. You're not trying to find the answer to life, the universe, and everything. Most of us aren't devoting all of our actions to curing cancer and nothing but. We don't have a singular focus. Rather, we are trying to have a harmony of different ends rather than one overriding purpose. And the third objection is that Aristotle has committed what is called the quantifier shift fallacy. We talked about this in our previous lecture. And the objection is something like this. Just because every road comes to a stop in some place doesn't mean that there's one place where all roads stop. That's a false inference. So Aristotle seems to be making the inference because every action is directed to some end, there must be one end all actions are directed towards. Let's table these for a second and look at how McInerny interprets Aristotle's understanding of happiness and the ultimate end in a way that negates these objections. So, McInerny takes Aristotle's definition of happiness to be intensive, not extensive. The difference between intensive and extensive is as follows. An intensive conception is where we understand a concept by its definition. We say, what do we intend when we use this word? An extensive consideration of a concept says, what are all the things to which this concept applies? So, if, for example, I were to give an extensive account of football player, I would name every single person who is a football player. If I gave an intensive account of football player, I would give you a definition of what football player means, a definition which is common to and applied to every member of that previous group. So he's saying here that Aristotle is considering happiness or the ultimate end in an intensive way, not in an extensive way. So he doesn't think that there's one particular action that fulfills us, but rather there's something common to all human actions which determines whether each one of them is fulfilling to us. So the idea that of happiness or the ultimate end is not that we do everything in order that we can perform some one action and that action will perfect us. Rather that there's a common characteristic that can be found in actions that perfect us, in actions that make us happy. So all actions that make us happy have some common characteristic, and all actions that don't make us happy lack this common characteristic. And we, therefore, according to Aristotle, are considering what makes human actions good insofar as they are human actions. Since all the things that we do are done by us and we are humans, we want to say, well, what is the ultimate end of human type actions? Because that will be proper and intensively shared by all actions we perform. So, this is something we are seeking, and it's aimed for in every human act, which includes both subordinate and superordinate ends if they are fundamentally human. Thus, we aim for the same ultimate end in bridle making that we do in horse riding, even though one is for the sake of the other. And so this is where, obviously, Aristotle turns to virtuous activity as the definition of happiness, that virtuous activity in accord with reason, right, is what makes us happy in a complete life. So, to quote McInerny, virtuous activity or living humanly well do not signify one thing, because there are different kinds of rational activity and thus different kinds of virtue, and our happiness or perfection or ultimate end is constituted not by some one virtue, but, to the degree this is possible, by them all. So Aristotle's understanding... Oh, you want some watermelon? Sorry for that interruption. We'll be right back after we get some watermelon. So then, since Aristotle takes happiness or understands happiness to be something common to any good human action, we say an action is good if it makes us happy. And so in this way, Aristotle can avoid the objections earlier. So if we look at this summary of what Aristotle has said in the way McInerny has read him, we can take it as follows. First, the ultimate end of human activity is a state or characteristic which each action aims at. So it's to be performed well be performed well in accord with right reason. Quote, man's ultimate end is not some particular good among others, but is constituted by a plurality of virtuous activities. That set of activities may be seen as ordered in terms either of necessity or of nobility. So the idea is, right, that Aristotle, when he's talking about happiness, he's talking about a way in which any action you do is performed. You either perform actions in a way that will make you happy, that will fulfill you, that will perfect you, or you perform actions in a way that is not perfective, fulfilling, and satisfying. And the commonality to actions that are performed in a way that fulfill us and perfect us is that we, one, use reason to determine how they should be best performed, and two, that we perform them in a way that will help us develop habits that enable us to perform that same action well in the future. The particular activities, because there are many different activities that we perform as human beings, do not necessarily have one particular order in which they must be performed. So we can order them either in terms of necessity or of nobility. So it seems that we first need to perform actions concerning sustenance and shelter, earning money, right, in order to buy food and pay the rent, right? So actions involved in that way, actions involved with eating and with socializing and the like need to be performed before we can have the time or the leisure to perform actions such as contemplating the truth or doing philosophy. However, it seems that the lower actions, that of eating, that of working, to the extent that we can view working as a means to an end, those actions are ordered to the higher actions of the more noble actions, right, of contemplation, of religious devotion, etc., 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 such that we can see the two orders, right? We perform the lower ones first, and they are more important because they are more necessary. If you don't eat, or if you're not virtuous with regards to eating, with regards to doing your work well, you're not going to be able to perform these more noble actions. So what comes first? What do we focus on first? We focus on the moral virtues concerned with making sure that we're good and we're acting well in the small things, in the necessary aspects of daily life. On the other hand, we can say we should focus first on the highest and most noble activities, insofar as those are what are most important. And we can't be happy if we're merely can't be as fully happy if we merely are virtuous with regards to food or drink, are virtuous with regards to spending our money properly, that there's more to life than just working, for example. So those are the two ways that Aristotle would view this. Now, this interpretation of happiness as a characteristic shared by all human activities that makes them fulfilling defends Aristotle from those objections earlier. Remember, the objections were not all actions are for the sake of one distinct end, that we could go in a circle, right? I try to obtain health in order to obtain other ends, which ultimately are means to obtain health. Well, in that case, each action, if I'm trying to obtain health, I'm trying to obtain health in a way that is perfective of me. And then I am working, trying to be healthy so I can perform my job well. Well, when I perform my job, I try to perform my job in a way that is perfective of me, right? I try to do the best work I can. So that would seem to dismiss that first objection. The second objection, right, is that we don't do everything for the sake of one single goal. We want a harmony of ends. Well, insofar as this perfective state can be achieved by performing different actions, and Aristotle doesn't think there's one single action that will make us happy, that if we don't perform it, we can never be happy at all. Aristotle's not talking in the way that this objection thinks. In fact, he would agree with the objector. We want a harmony of ends, but they're only harmonized if they're all performed in a way that is perfective of us. The third one, the quantifier shift fallacy, once again presumes that there is one single activity, one single action that is perfective of us. Just because every act aims at some goal doesn't mean there's one single action that all actions are directed towards. Aristotle says there's one general criteria for judging all actions. There's one general state which can be found in every different action. All right, so as we were saying, uh, the quantifier shift fallacy here presumes that Aristotle's thinking of one particular distinct goal rather than a common characteristic present in every action, that all actions are aimed towards the good of man by being performed in the right way. And that characteristic, which is common to all cases, that is what Aristotle means, and that avoids the quantifier shift fallacy. Nonetheless, McInerny recognizes that Aristotle's understanding of happiness still requires a good deal of development. It's one thing to say that there's a common characteristic to all human actions, which, when present in all those actions, will make us happy, and when not present in in all of our actions, will not fulfill us. But we need to go further to understand what is that characteristic. What does it mean to talk about rational activity? What does virtue mean? Yeah? Because there's so many different things we can do. So what ultimately is the good? Now with this in mind, he then turns to Aquinas' understanding of goodness and how Aquinas builds on Aristotle. So this should be viewed in some ways as helping understand the previous lecture from this week on Aquinas. So McInerny here is looking at what Aquinas writes in Summa Theologiae Secunda Prima Secundae, so in the first part of the second part, questions 1 through 5. So he notes that Aristotle, when understanding good, makes a distinction between a formal definition of good and the material definition. A formal definition is what is meant by the term. Yeah, it's the formality that's present in any case of something good. And Aquinas is saying that all men desire goodness. That is to say, everything that we desire, all of our choices, all of our goals are made in terms of this formal aspect. So Aquinas says, and so did Aristotle, that all men desire the good. Now, why is it that all men? So the way that Aquinas gets to or defends the idea that everybody desires the good is by distinguishing between what we understand to be good, that is, generically speaking, and good is defined as what is perfect, fulfilling, and satisfying, from a material definition, which identifies the kind of things that are actually good, what is required for something to be perfect, fulfilling, and satisfying. So in this way, since an action is called good if it is perfective, fulfilling, and satisfying for an agent, it can be that which tends towards achieving perfection, fulfillment, and satisfaction of the agent. However, this notion of the ultimate good as what is perfect, fulfilling, and satisfying is not sufficient to distinguish good and bad people or good and bad actions. Different things perfect, fulfill, and satisfy in different contexts. And further, since people have differing opinions about what is perfect, fulfilling, and satisfying, we can't merely use those terms as if it's obvious the way they apply to human beings. We need to look at the nature of human beings in relation to perfection, fulfillment, and satisfaction in order to understand what this is. Further, as Aquinas says here, we must recognize that good is not a univocal, but rather an analogical concept. And since good is not univocal, but rather analogical, there won't be a single way in which something is perfective or... So, where were we? Yes, Aquinas treats good in this way, so he distinguishes the generic notion of goodness as perfective, fulfilling, and satisfying from what actually is perfective, fulfilling, and satisfying. Because, one, people who act wrongly think that they're perfecting, satisfying, and fulfilling themselves, but they're not. Secondly, it seems that there's not one single definition of perfection, fulfillment, or satisfaction that we can apply, because if I, for example, do a really good job mowing the front lawn, that seems to perfect, fulfill, and satisfy me in a different way than if I grasp a very, very hard concept or I gain a new piece of knowledge. You can say, oh, both are a job well done, but one is perfecting me insofar as I'm doing a good job as a homeowner, doing a good job as someone taking care of the lawn, performing a physical action. The other one is an intellectual activity. So it seems like they're not perfective in the same way, right? So we need to have a broader notion of perfective than just a simple idea that can be found in every single case univocally. More on that in a moment. All right, so let's look at how Aquinas develops Aristotle more. He brings in the idea of perfect happiness and imperfect happiness, as we saw in the reading from Aquinas. So, as McInerny notes, that all men desire their goals under the formality of goodness. However, as we said, many ends are not truly perfective or are erroneously thought to be so, depending on what we know is actually perfecting. So Aquinas says, what is actually perfecting of us? Well, in order to do that, we need to consider the notion of good. So we desire good universally, that we don't desire a particular kind of good, we just desire goodness. We desire something because we think it's an instance of good. We think it's something that's a good thing. So ultimately, if I desire ice cream, I don't desire ice cream for its molecular structure. I don't desire ice cream for its particular color. I desire ice cream insofar as I think it's in some way good. So, therefore, what I'm really desiring about the ice cream isn't its ice creamness, but its goodness. Yeah? So if there is something which actually is goodness, which embodies all the things that I seek in every single instance, if there's one thing that is actual goodness itself, which is equivalent to that formality under which I desire everything, that will be my ultimate end. And for Aquinas, that which completely embodies the formality of goodness is God. God is good, and God is truth. And so therefore, knowledge of God perfects our intellect, because our intellect is ordered towards truth and is perfected by grasping truth. Thus, knowing God would completely perfect our intellect. And our desire for goodness ultimately can only be fully achieved and fully satisfied if we can attain this source of all goodness, that which is good in itself, which Aquinas says is God. Because of this, we can never achieve complete happiness in this life. Actions in this life make us happy insofar as they share in or are directed towards that perfect happiness, which Aquinas calls the beatific vision. So in this, Aquinas is developing upon Aristotle. Aquinas is saying that there is one ultimate activity which is perfective of us, namely the beatific vision, but that is not something that can be achieved in this life. Therefore, the notion of good as a commonality found in every single action, but in different and unique ways, is something we still need to search for, but we now have a standard which can help us look at that. All human actions are good insofar as they participate in, or are reflective of, or imitative of, in some way, the perfection that we have in the beatific vision. So let's look at McInerny's talk about Aquinas' treatment of happiness in this life. And this is where we look at the fact that good is not said in the same way in every single case. Ice cream is not good in the same way that getting an A on a test is good. It's not good in the same way that mowing my lawn well is good. It's not good in the same way that true love is good. It's not good in the same way that being just is good. So there's different ways in which actions can be good. So, for Aquinas, good is analogical. That means that doing well involves a plurality of goods that are constituents of man's end in this life. Now, that which is perfective of human action is not some single good, because rational activity is not some single kind of activity. So in order to understand this point, in McInerny's interpretation of Aquinas, we need to understand the distinction between univocal, equivocal, and analogous terms. So Aquinas follows this distinction. This is also found in Aristotle. But an equivocal word is something, let me back up. A univocal term is one which is used in the same way and has the same meaning in multiple cases. An equivocal term is a word which is used in completely unrelated ways. That is, it has completely different meanings. The same word is used, the same vocal sound is used, but I mean something completely different in the various ways that I use it. Thus, there's nothing unified between those cases, and I can't give a unified account of all of them. And then last, there's analogous, which is between univocal, where we have the same standard applied in every single case, and equivocal, where there's a different standard in each case. In an analogous case, analogous term, the word is used in different ways, but there's some common notion in the various cases which allows us to see that they belong together or they can be grouped together, even if there's not one single uniform standard that's perfectly embodied in every single case. So let's look at 3 examples of univocal, equivocal, analogous terms. So for univocal term, man, we say Socrates is a man, Plato is a man, and J.J. Watt is a man. When I call Socrates, Plato, and J.J. Watt a man, I use the same word, man, and I mean this exact same thing, rational animal. Yeah, Socrates is a rational animal, Plato is a rational animal, J.J. Watt is a rational animal. This is different from equivocal, where, I'm sorry, that's the same definition, shouldn't say different definition. Oops. In this case, we say, you need to pay your bill, a duck has a bill, and Bill is a friend of mine. Bill is used, the word bill is used 3 times, but I mean something completely different in each case. Last, we have analogous or related definitions. So you might call Socrates healthy. You might say jogging is healthy, and therefore, if Socrates wants to remain healthy, he should jog. And you might say your complexion is healthy. If you say Socrates has healthy-looking skin, Socrates' skin is healthy, we don't mean the exact same thing in each case. In the case of saying Socrates is healthy, we say Socrates possesses health. We say jogging is healthy, we don't mean jogging possesses health, rather jogging promotes or causes or sustains health. And when we say that complexion of skin is healthy, we don't mean that complexion has health, but rather a particular complexion is a sign of health, right? So in this way, all of these instances are all called healthy. We mean something slightly different in each case, but there's a commonality of notion. We understand all of them relate to the idea of being healthy, of your body being in a healthy state. And thus it is in the case of happiness or rational activity in accord with virtue, because rational activity is used in different ways. Rational activity can be used to describe the following actions. Grasping the first principles of reality and of truth is a rational activity. It's an activity performed by reason, and it belongs to reason, and it perfects reason. Scientific explanation is a rational activity. It's an activity which is done using reason and is properly belongs to reason. Explanation is an activity which is properly rational. It doesn't use reason as an adjunct to guide it, but it's done only using reason. Contemplating the divine is a rational activity as well. That activity is done using reason and only using reason. It is perfective of reason, and it is the highest activity that reason can do. So those first 3 are rational activities in different ways, but there is something common to them, namely that they are performed using reason alone, or properly using reason. However, deciding what to do is a rational activity, and performing actions which you've deliberated about is a rational activity. In those cases, we use reason to determine how we should act. The deliberation or the thinking about what we should do isn't the ultimate end, unlike contemplating the divine. Oh my goodness, there's so many typos in this. Contemplating the divine is a rational activity, but it's rational activity insofar as that's something which reason does for its own sake. We decide what to do using reason for the sake of doing it, and the action that is performed is not performed with our power of reason, but is being guided by it. Likewise, we can say making a birdhouse is a rational activity. There, that doesn't actually use reason, but it's guided by reason. The steps involved in making a birdhouse are guided by thinking through how do I achieve a birdhouse. Likewise, it's a rational activity insofar as I choose to make birdhouses. I don't think anyone just makes birdhouses unintentionally. I think birdhouse making is something which we reason about. So, in each of these cases, we can see that rational activity is a true description of the action, but they're rational activities in different ways. Yeah? Grasping the first principle is a rational activity, which is necessary for explaining. Explaining is a rational activity using reason, which has a product, namely knowledge. Contemplating the divine, not the diving, is a rational activity which doesn't have a further product. It is the ultimate perfection of our reason, because it is reflecting on the knowledge we have. Deciding what to do and making a birdhouse are rational activities insofar as they are activities directed towards some product outside of reason. In the first case, the activity of deciding what to do is performed by reason for the sake of something that is not done using our rational power alone. We use our physical powers. And making a birdhouse is the activity itself, which is done using non-rational powers, but is guided by reason. I use my physical powers. I used my ability to hammer nails and to saw wood, etc. Thus, we use happiness to evaluate our actions in this way. Actions that directly perfect our rational powers are judged based on whether or not they arrive at truth. We judge them based off of their products in terms of reason. We judge them based off of what it is that we are considering. Actions that use reason to achieve their ends are evaluated in a different way. They're based off of two things. First, we say, are you performing this action well in terms of the kind of action that it is? So if you're playing music, did you play the music well or poorly? Did you play the notes correctly? Did you hit all the notes? Did you play the right tempo? Did you do a good job as a musician? And so we evaluate such actions, birdhouse making, on, is this a house in which birds can actually live? Is it something that's durable? So we evaluate the actions in terms of the type of action that they are. However, we can also evaluate them in terms of how they participate or contribute to our comprehensive good as human beings. So we can ask, does playing music fulfill us as human beings? Furthermore, if playing music does fulfill us, it is satisfying. We can say, does the music that you're playing, the particular song that you're playing, given the music or arrangement or the lyrics involved, is that something that is perfective and fulfilling of you as a human being? So we can evaluate these actions based off of two things. One, based off of, are you doing a good job at playing music or making a birdhouse? And secondly, is this kind of activity worth doing in the first place? And if it is the particulars of how you're doing it, or what you're doing when you do it, yes? The kind of music you're performing, is that something that is perfective and fulfilling of us as humans, not just as musicians? Atonal music can be performed very, very well or very, very poorly. You can do a good job performing atonal music or a bad job performing atonal music. However, I would say atonal music is not something that's really satisfying or fulfilling. It's not good music. It's not something that really lifts the human spirit or really nurtures us in any way. So although you can do a good job technically at performing atonal music, I don't necessarily think atonal music is something that we really should listen to, and I don't think it's very very worthwhile for us. But that's, as I said, my own opinion. All right, I will see you then in the next lecture on McInerny on Aquinas.